Good evening, everybody, for the third time. And I need to ask people in the back row if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes, somebody nodded right at the back. Tonight's talk is entitled 1,210 Years in 60 Minutes. It spans a historical period that starts with a small Saxon forest clearing and ends with the establishment of a small suburban community centred around a station in the year 1910. Each slide will depict an aspect of Highams Park's history, and each is in chronological order. I hope to show you how, like many small places in England, the history of Highams Park is the history of England. The history of Highams Park is also, of course, particular to this geographical area, and after the talk, I do hope you will see that we have our history all around us. Saxons first invaded this part of England as early as 449, and the next 400 years saw waves of occupation. At first there appear to have been a number of smaller kingdoms in Essex. Our locality was near the kingdom of Uppingus, modern-day Epping, and the kingdom of Herotha, which is where the Rodings are now. Essex was one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that became the unified kingdom of England in the year 927. But what of Highams Park? We do not know what the early Saxon settlers called this place, later called Hale End, but it is certain that Hale End was centred around the triangle of ground that is in front of the Royal Oak pub. Saxons lived in small villages. They felled trees, they farmed, and they grazed animals freely. The area I just mentioned was perfect for these activities, situated as it was so near to fresh running water, the river we now call the River Ching. The first place name that we have recorded is actually the name Heckham, Hecham, the name of the manor. And in 1066, the manor was held by a man named Haldan. He was a Saxon freeman. The Saxons divided their kingdoms first into hundreds, secondly into parishes, and thirdly into manors. A hundred was meant to be roughly the area of land that you needed to, that 100 people would live on. We are now in what was Beaconstree 100, and it was the parish of Wolfmans Stowe, and it was the manor of Heckham. Soon after 1066, however, as you all know, a great deal changed. The Norman conquest of 1066 led to great changes all over England. In this area by 1086, which was the date of the Domesday Inquiry or Survey, the Domesday Book we often call it, the manor of Heckham was newly held by a Norman nobleman named of Peter de Valogna. Now, I don't know how long that name would have lasted. Some of you might know there is a road off Billet Road or somewhere up on Higham Hill called whatever, I don't know how people pronounce it nowadays. A bit like Thaden Boyce having been Bois, this man would have at some point, or his family would have been called the Valognes. Sorry, let me say it in French, Norman French even, the Valognes. Anyway, I always wonder what happened to old Haldan, but Haldan went in a type of ethnic cleansing, I suppose. This was a period this was a period where the Great Forest of Waltham had been disafforested over a number of centuries. Saxon, just the sort of mode of living of the Saxons meant animals running freely tended to eat the shoots of new trees. So the forest of the Great Forest of Waltham didn't suddenly get felled at the time of the Normans. That had been happening for a number of centuries. However, what we do know is under the new Norman occupation, more forest was taken. We can tell this by the figures of the Domesday Book. There were 300 swine in 1066, but only 18 in 1086. Nothing to do, I think, with any sort of pig fever or a plague. That simply, historians believe that is to do with forests being cut, with woodland being cut down. You see 1 ox, 15 cattle, or meadowland, and the manor was worth 60 shillings in 1066, whereas it had increased to the value of £4 10 shillings in 1086. Peter de Valognes was the first Norman lord of the manor. From 1070 to 1076, he did very, very well under King William, and he was granted lands in Hertfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Lincolnshire. He was also the sheriff of both Essex and Hertfordshire. He was a non-resident lord of the manor. In fact, his castle, a Motte and Bailey castle that his family built, is in a place called Benningson in Hertfordshire. I'm led to believe this is somewhere just outside Stevenage. The house there is open to the public sometimes, and there is still a Norman ruin. In the Middle Ages, a manor was a district over which a lord had domain and could exercise certain rights and privileges. The manor house was usually separate from where villagers live. The Manor of Heckham, and I'll show you a map of it. It's actually a modern day map. But can you see where Highams Park is just here? Chingford Lane is there. South Chingford, the Billet, just there. The first manor house was here on Higham Hill. So you see the shape of this manor, the shape of the manor. Historians, I suppose folk historians, call this a leg of mutton shape or a leg of lamb shape. The Manor of Heckham was this leg of mutton shape, and as I said, it included the areas of South Chingford, Highams Park as we know it today, a little bit of Woodford, and Higham Hill in Wolfmans Stowe. From the time of Peter de Valognes, Heckham seems not to have had a resident lord of the manor. The manor passed down through the generations of his family until it got to William de Valognes. When he died in 1235, William de Valognes left the manor to his three daughters. Now, I think that would have been quite unusual at that period of the Middle Ages. Three daughters, and I'll just give you an idea of who those daughters were, or who they married in fact, because they were all married to Anglo-Norman noblemen who lived in Scotland. I don't know if they would have called themselves Scottish at that point, probably not, but they were certainly Anglo-Normans. And the first was, I'll take it back, you'll recognise some of these names from street names and place names, of course. Balliol ended up being the derivation of Balliol Avenue. Laura de Balliol, one of the daughters of William de Valognes, married Sir Henry de Balliol. Just to give you an idea, Sir Henry de Balliol was Chamberlain of Scotland. Isabel married David Comyn. He was Baron of Kilbride. And Christina Maule married Peter Maule of Panmure Castle. As I sort of alluded to, the lives of these women, I think, would make a very, very good subject for research. They received a third of the manor each, but the manor wasn't formally divided up. They did receive a third of the manor each, but it remained the manor of Heckham. However, in 1303, the manor was divided, and I'm not sure if you know or are aware of the name Salisbury Hall. The manor of Salisbury Hall was actually carved out of the centre of the manor of Heckham. I'd say that most people who live in Highams Park think they live in what used to be the manor of Higham Benstead later, or the manor of Heckham from the Middle Ages. However, if we look at this map again, slightly clearer map, the green line is the manor of Salisbury Hall. So can you see the avenue, the top of the avenue, right the way round to the dog stadium, all of the sort of Winchester Road houses, Beechell Road houses, all of those houses, well, they are houses now, that's where the manor of Salisbury Hall is. The manor passed through various different lords of the manor from 1303 onwards, and again you might recognise some names of roads and places. Beatoun became Baytown Gardens, and from Harmon we have Harmon Close. In the early Middle Ages, I'm sure some of you are aware, the typical system of farming in England was that of strip farming, ridge and furrow farming. The lord of the manor had domain, and farms were very, very open places. Around the time of the Black Death, 1348 to 1350, there ended up being a dramatic depopulation of England just after the Black Death. Some say this is one of the reasons why farming practices changed. I'm sure it's one of many reasons why farming practices changed in the Middle Ages. A smaller number of farms tended to need larger spaces of land, or they rented larger spaces of land. These are two of our local farms from that period. Jack's Farm from 1505 and Stretman's from 1433. I'll show you on a map where those two farms were, and you'll have a very good idea of their location. Right, let's see. This road here is Hayland Road. The station is in the middle. The Royal Oak is here. Oak Hill goes up the hill this way, and Hayland Road carries on that way. This farm here, it's entitled the Manor House. That was Stretman's farm. And Jack's Farm is roughly where the industrial estate was. I'll come to that a bit later. But it was the site of Jack's Farm that the Xylonite Company bought in the 1890s. So Jack's Farm 1505 and Stretman's 1433. One of our members, Malcolm Sheichels, made this map a number of years ago, and if you want me to send it to you, we can send it through the Highams Park Society. These are ancient field boundaries, and again, I'll show you where we are. This is the River Ching, going right to left. Can you all see that? River Ching. Hayland Road goes this way. Hayland Road, Larkshaw Road. The Rolls is there. And then Stretman's, the Manor House, is here, and this road here is Oak Hill. If you transpose a modern day map of Highams Park, you'll find many of your back gardens are in fact these field boundaries. Many of the trees remain. A number of you, if you have a protected tree anywhere near your house, it will be from somewhere in the 17 or 1800s. Actually, that alarm still hasn't gone off, has it? Sorry, I do apologise. In 1676, Wolfmans Stowe Windmill was built. A windmill was built right at the top of Oak Hill. The area at the top of Oak Hill, which is just near to the petrol station there on the Woodford New Road, is to this day known as Mill Plain. That is a very, very high site. It is 220 feet above sea level. As I said, it's now known as Mill Plain. In Essex, by the year 1777, there were in fact 187 windmills. It's a very good county for windmills. It's fairly flat. Some areas are quite high. And the ridge at Woodford, a ridge formed by a glacier tens of thousands of years ago, is one of the highest points in the county of Essex. The main purpose of a mill such as the Wolfmans Stowe windmill was to ground corn so that villagers, peasants, could actually make bread. The Wolfmans Stowe windmill is actually stood outside of our manor, the boundary of the Manor of Highams, but because of where it was, right at the top of Oak Hill, ended up being a mill that was used by people from the hamlet of Hale End and also from people who lived in Woodford. In 1805, it appears in an Ordnance Survey map. However, it had been pulled down a few years before that. So it had a life literally from 1676 to about 1801 or 1802. It was superseded by mills that were on the River Lee. So once transportation became easier and roads became better, and larger quantities could be milled in the bigger mills on the River Lee. It was, in fact, a post mill. Can you see that from the illustration? If you've been to Finchingfield or to Aythorpe Roding, and imagine the windmills you've seen there, post mills or windmills that could swivel around on a post and get the most favourable wind current. The picture on the right is not of a Brickworks, and it's not actually a tile kiln house. It is of one of the villas built by the Warner family in the 1880s. The Warners being the lords of the manor, and I'll come to that later. This house here is on the edge of the bridle path. If you imagine, is it St Patrick's Court, the block of flats? St Patrick's Court is somewhere here, actually. So we say St Patrick's Court is here, and this is the corner, right, it's the corner of the bridle path, and Oak Hill coming down the hill from here to here. It was around the late 1500s that brick became used in domestic and agricultural buildings. This part of East Anglia has no local stone, so manufacture of bricks was something that was very important. In Highams Park there was, and actually still are, local deposits of sand and clay called they were called many years ago brick earth. So we have in the forest, just by the bridle path, going right the way up to the top of Oak Hill, deposits of sand and clay called brick earth. In 1607, John Russell enclosed a section of land roughly where the bridle path is now. This area is called Higham Bushes on some maps. The site at its peak reached all the way to the Forest Lodge. I don't know how many of you have been to the lodge in the forest at the end of the bridle path. That lodge was actually the entrance to the White House. But the brickworks at their peak reached right the way across to the lodge, near to the back of Harmon Villas and Lodge Villas off Woodford New Road, and right the way up to the top of Oak Hill. So it was quite a sort of sizable undertaking. A building called Tile Kiln House, a very pretty building, a tile and brick building, was demolished in 1820. During the 1700s, various lords of the manor put up with the brickworks. I can imagine it was dirty. I could imagine there was smoke, and they put up with it. Some of the lords of the manor were very happy making a good rent from the brickworks. However, William Hornby became the lord of the manor in 1785. 1785, William Hornby became lord of the manor, and he bought back the lease. He had had enough of brickworks on his or near to his manorial grounds. A number of people in Highams Park and Woodford have always called those called parts of the forest there bomb craters, and it has been believed until very, very recently that if you walked down the bridle path or up to the top of Oak Hill, that if you were on a bike, in your teens or whatever age, you still go over bomb craters. People believe they were cycling in and out of bomb craters. There's possibly one bomb crater on the right-hand side of Oak Hill, but all of those are actually holes caused by earthworks, the digging out of brick earth or the digging out of gravel. So all of those so-called bomb craters, you can tell people after this if they ever ask you, they're nothing to do with First World War or Second World War bombs. They are to do with the brickworks. And again, the brickworks were extensive. You can imagine that land. We have a tendency to imagine Epping Forest as always being Epping Forest. It wasn't really until the Epping Forest Act of 1878 that the forest was protected. But before that, there were all sorts of incursions onto forest land, and the brickworks being one of them. From the late 1600s, Wolfmans Stowe was an area that was favoured by wealthy families with London connections. And just if you imagine Wolfmans Stowe, think of Brookscroft, think of Thorpe Combe, think of Wolfmans Stowe House, number of houses in Wolfmans Stowe Village, the Chestnuts on Hoe Street. Those houses were lived in by wealthy London merchants, and Wolfmans Stowe was certainly a very select and popular suburb of London, or not really, it was a popular place outside of London, I should say, for wealthy city merchants to live in. Hale End, being an outlying area of Walthamstow, became very popular, or fairly popular, in the 1700s. I'll show you this map. This is Beech Hall. Beech Hall, now Swallow Court, stood opposite the Royal Oak. There's the Chestnuts is here. The Manor House was still a working farm in that period, but we have a number of other buildings: Forest Hall, Willow Cottage, Sky Peels, Forest Lodge. They're all from different periods, but it was around about the early 1700s that the first of these became a house for, as I said, wealthy city families. Give you an example of the Chestnuts. The Chestnuts stood roughly where Holly Crescent is now. If you stand on Oak Hill, face Holly Crescent and look towards Larkswood, that was where the Chestnuts was. And the Chestnuts was an incredible house. It was on 3 floors, had 2 pleasure gardens, a kitchen garden, an orchard, a canal, 2 fish ponds, and 15 acres of meadowland. Very, very nice place. William Loxham and his family lived there. And Loxham was a wealthy city hatter and sword cutler. So a wealthy city merchant was living in Hayland with a number of other wealthy merchants in this period. A story of London spreading wealth. Highams, now Woodford County High for girls, was the manor house of the Manor of Higham Benstead. The name of the manor changed at various points over those 1,000 years. The original manor house was in Higham Hill, and you may remember an old people's home, or know of an old people's home. It was called Essex Hall, just off Black Horse Road. Essex Hall was built on the site of Essex Hall, funnily enough, and Essex Hall was the first manor house of the Manor of Higham Benstead. I'll just take you back to that slide. Essex Hall was about here, and Highams is way over here. This is Wadham Road, going between the 2 parts of the manor. As I said, the original manor house was at Higham Hill, but in 1768, the Lord of the Manor, who by then was Anthony Bacon, commissioned the architect William Newton to build, and I quote, a square brick house with wings. It is a little bit more than that, I should say, a square brick house with wings, but the original Highams looked something like this. Why did he move the manor house? Well, the air would have been better, being on this side of Highams Park. It was away from the Lee Valley, and also in terms of social life, there would have been a number of families living around Woodford and Buckhurst Hill, who would have provided a sort of very elite social community that the Lord of the Manor would have been part of. So Highams became the manor house. In 1790, John Harmon, who was a wealthy banker, became Lord of the Manor. And in 1793, John Harmon commissioned Humphry Repton to landscape the grounds. Humphry Repton was a very well-known landscape gardener in the 1780s and 90s. He is in fact the only real person that Jane Austen writes about. I think in Mansfield Park, the good Mr. Repton is called to draw up plans for the alterations at Mansfield Park. So Repton would have been known all over England. Repton was asked to landscape the grounds. The Red Book, and what Repton did was he put all of his plans in a notebook that he called the Red Book for each house. If you want to view it, you can book an appointment in the Vestry House Museum, for they have the Red Book for Highams. The work consisted, mainly I would say, of the creation of Highams Park Lake, and this was done by damming the River Ching. It always sounds wrong, that phrase, but by damming the River Ching, he was able to create Highams Park Lake. The way he did it was not as you might expect. The River Ching, as we know it now, doesn't flow it flows alongside the lake, but doesn't flow in its original course or position. The River Ching used to, before the lake was built, flow roughly where the north bank of the lake is. So if you imagine standing facing the lake with the lake field behind you, the Highams Park behind you, facing the lake, and look at the edge of the water, that was the original course of the River Ching. In fact, the River Ching still does, the real River Ching, still does flow out of it in an overflow. But what Humphry Repton did was he made a dam, he made a lake, and he planted a number of trees, and as I say, provided a very, very nice form of landscaping. That was 1793. I'm going to fast forward you now to the year 1890. Sir Courtney Warner, who was the Lord of the Manor in the late 1800s, sold the lake to the Corporation of London. So the lake and what we call the Highams Park was sold to the Corporation of London in the year 1890. In 1894, Highams Park Station was renamed, supposed to benefit from the name of the lake. What the Great Eastern Railway did was they saw a real opportunity, an early version of marketing, a concept. They advertised Highams Park as the most beautiful lake within a day's travel of London. I'm sure many of you agree that it still is. And the Great Eastern Railway advertised Highams Park in that way. It would be very interesting to find the poster. The poster isn't in Vestry House Museum, but it must be somewhere in National Rail Archives. The coming of the railway, however, changed everything. In the 1880s, housing started to be built, and Courtney Warner was in fact our last resident lord of the manor. The Warners left Highams Park in 1902, and in 1919, after a brief period of use as a First World War military hospital, Highams, didn't look like that then, but Highams became Woodford, first of all became Woodford School for Girls, now Woodford County High, 1919. This is Sir Thomas Courtney Thaden Warner, known as Courtney Warner. I believe this is Humphry Repton with a surveying tool, an early etching. And here we have our lovely Humphreys. Humphreys in the park. People often wonder why it's spelt like that, and obviously we do explain. It is named after Humphry Repton. In 1820, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened. And as we know, the rest is history. The Chingford line was originally much shorter and went first of all from Stratford to just Shernhall Street, not even Wood Street. Stratford to Shernhall Street. In 1872, a set of track was built from Hackney Downs to St James Street, and in 1873 the line was extended to Hale End. At first the terminus wasn't Liverpool Street was built later on, but the terminus was Bishopsgate lower level station. That station's always fascinated me, because I don't know if you've ever looked out of the train when as the train nears Liverpool Street, there are platforms about 400 yards? About 400 yards before Liverpool Street. And those platforms are what remains of Bishopsgate low-level station. There were plans originally to build the line, to actually extend the line further. The line wasn't meant to finish at North Chingford. In fact, the stations were meant to be as follows: Wood Street, Inks Green, Chingford and High Beach. As you all know, this didn't happen. But Highams Park was a temporary station for a number of years. The Hale Park estate, the roads just where we are in fact, the avenue, Handsworth Avenue, Gordon Avenue, Falmouth Avenue and somewhere else, Castle Avenue, were all laid out in the 1880s. And so we think the 1880s, those roads were laid out, plots were sold off. In 1894, Hitchman sold off some of his land. John Hitchman was a Wolfmans Stowe dairyman, and the Wadham Farm Estate started to be developed. The Wadham Farm Estate was a very grand name, and the Wadham Farm Estate is now the roads of Cavendish Road, Selwyn Avenue, Haldon, Newbury and Winchester Road. Can you imagine? Development had started with a temporary station. 1903 was when Highams Park Station was built. It was designed by Neville Ashby, who was the architect, the main architect of the Great Eastern Railway, and the man who designed the whole of Liverpool Street Station. I'm sure you all agree that Highams Park is a fine station. It's a very, very interesting building. There isn't a station actually that looks anything like it anywhere else on the region. But then most of the Great Eastern Railway stations were quite idiosyncratic in their designs. Story about early plastics. We are now in the late 1890s. Well, just a little bit before that. Because in the 1850s, Alexander Parkes discovered Parkestein and he patented it. It was an early form of plastic, a form of celluloid. Parkestein was used as a substitute for ivory, wood, horn and tortoiseshell. hence later on the Xylolites logo. Looks a bit unfortunate these days, but the tortoise walking arm in arm with the elephant, tusks and shell. Daniel Spill, who was another inventor, worked with Alexander Parkes in the 1870s, and they invented xylonite. Celluloid. They invented celluloid before it was invented in America, but they weren't allowed the patent. The British Xylonite Company was established first at Hackney Wick. There were factories at Hackney Wick, factories in Homerton. However, the manufacturing process was very, very dangerous, and there was the need to move to a far less populous area. In 1887, the Xylonite Works, a branch of the Xylonite factory, moved to Brantham in Suffolk, and in 1897, the Xylonite Works, a branch of the Xylonite Works, moved to Hale End. Hale End, as this area was known in those days, was in the parish of Wolfmans Stowe, and the site of the Xylonite Works was actually the site of Jack's Farm. Jack's Farm came up for sale, 50 acres were for sale, and the Halex Works moved to Highams Park. At one point, I'm sure you know some of the legends about Halex and Xylonite. At one point, the company had virtually a world monopoly, and you probably say it, of table tennis balls. And at its peak, this factory employed over 2,000 people. It's hard to imagine the impact that such a works would have had on such a small area, such a small community. Because when the Halex Works opened in the 1890s, most of central Highams Park was not developed, had not been developed. Xylonite was a family firm, owned and founded by the Merriam family, a Quaker family, very, very paternalistic employers. The Xylonite Works eventually were renamed Halex, Halex from Hale End, the X from Xylonite. And workers came to Highams Park. They came from Highams. Well, some of the workers in the Xylonite came from Highams Park. Many more workers, in fact, came from outlying areas. Mary Dunhill, our late historian, called it the factory in a garden. It had a sports field that in later years has become the Rolls Park. Tennis courts, bowls pitches, cricket clubs, a number of social activities. There were royal visits over the years, and a grand war memorial was erected in 1919, just after the First World War. The war memorial stood just somewhere behind the red brick building, which a number of you will remember. That building was only pulled down in about 1973 or 4, I believe, and the war memorial stood behind it. The war memorial was about 20 feet high and made of Portland stone. The reason I remember it, I don't remember that war memorial in fact, was because the Highams Park Society committee visited Brantham in Suffolk many years later, and the plaques that you see at the front of Hale End Library came from Brantham, where they had been removed to in 1974. So we have a direct link with the Halex Works right here in Hale End Library with the Halex plaques. This is a photo of, looks like a circus, doesn't it, really? But the man in the photo is Oscar Watling, O.H. Watling. And in 1885, when the Hale Park estate plots were being sold off, Oscar Watling, who was working as a builder and manufacturer in Hackney, bought a plot on the avenue. The plot number was plot number 66, but that doesn't correspond to modern numbering, so I'll have to do some more research to find out exactly where that was. But he built a number of 2 houses on the avenue. Then he built a house on Castle Avenue. You might be aware of the house that has the Christmas decorations outside. There's a house on Castle Avenue, number 40, I think it is. Always has a very extravagant set of Christmas decorations. That house was built by Oscar Watling. And if I tell you that Oscar Watling then laid out the Beech Hall estate, Beech Hall Road mainly, look at that house again. Obviously, don't look at it and stare at it and get into trouble and be embarrassing. But have a look at the design features. The house has been painted over the years. The whole house has been painted one colour, is what I mean. But you'll notice some of the interesting features of the beach hall houses were a replication of Watling's earlier buildings. He built one other house on Falmouth Avenue as well. That alarm is still going on, isn't it? As I said, Oscar Watling was a builder and a designer, I would say. He wouldn't have called himself. Excuse me. Oscar Watling, where was I? Yeah, actually, just to give you an idea of where this is taken, he's standing roughly where Shell's, the Country Grill. If you imagine where the Country Grill is, this is Hale End Road, going down almost in a curve. You don't really notice the curve, but when where the houses start at Beverley Road, that's where this corner is, nearly. Those houses are the houses between Silverdale and Beverley, and he's standing here in his, I suppose it's not a show house, but it's anyway, he was selling houses from there. What Watling did was he built Beach Hall Road, and if you ever get a chance to, or if you live in one of those houses, you will either be aware of, or you should look at, the design features. They're very, very interesting houses, and he had a real eye for design, a real eye for detail, and every 2 or 3 houses has some kind of different design feature. He could be said to be Mr. Highams Park. Why is this? Oscar Watling, Mr. Highams Park. Well, he also built the cinema. He built the Electric Theatre, and he built the shops on Hale End Road. When the Beach Hall estate was laid out in 1905, so we've got 3 waves of housing really, 1880, 1894 and 1905. When that Beach Hall Road estate was laid out, there wasn't any tangible centre to Highams Park. The station was just about being made permanent, or had just been made permanent, but there wasn't really a centre. However, Oscar Watling, with his cinema and his shops, created what I would think you would agree is a very interesting looking outer suburb. Not many places look exactly like Highams Park. There are a number of suburbs that are Edwardian suburbs. If you think about George Lane, Woodford, and Woodford, the other part of Woodford, Woodford Station and South Woodford Station, they are similar to Highams Park, but they didn't have an Oscar Watling. They didn't have a cinema built the way the Electric Theatre was built by him in 1909. Before Oscar Watling built the shops on Hale End Road, and before the centre of Highams Park developed, there were literally no shops. So there were a few shops on the avenue. If you imagine where Choice Cards is, and the what used to be Peter Dominic's off licence, now it's a hairdresser, those shops are raised above the road, a few feet I suppose. Those shops predate the shopping centre, and also Meg's newsagent, and the is it Dendale next door to Meg's? Those 2 shops also predate the shopping centre, but there were no other shops in the centre of Highams Park. If you lived on the Wadham Farm Estate, if you were an artisan, a skilled tradesman living on Winchester Road, there were about 16 shops on that estate that you would have bought your goods from. Butchers, bakers, there was even a laundry there. It was a self-supporting, self-contained community really. If you lived on the Hale Park estate, you would send your servants to go to Wood Street or to go to Walford Road. But the centre of Highams Park as we know it today did not exist. It was only Oscar Watling's, I suppose, his idea, his dream of a little place that he designed himself, and the fruition of that gave us the Highams Park we have today. As I said, Oscar Watling developed buildings in the centre of Highams Park. The subway was built in 1909, and at that point my talk comes to an abrupt end because we are at 1910. However, just like a train that goes off the buffers, all of that. I'm not going to talk you through all of that. However, between 1886, really the railway coming in 1873, and just before the end of the First World War, the expansion of Highams Park was very, very rapid. And I'll just mention a couple of these areas that I haven't referred to just yet. The railway, as I said, came in 1873. In 1886, farmland was sold off. That was farmland that was in the manor of Salisbury Hall to build, to help develop the Highams Park estate. The lake was sold to the Corporation of London around about 1891. A very big factor in Highams Park becoming, for a couple of decades at least, a London tourist destination. The Waltham Farm Estate, the terraced houses on the other side of the railway lines in Highams Park, were laid out from 1894, and that estate was developed in an interesting way. Hitchman, who was the dairyman whose land the estate was built on, sold the plots in strips, either in 2s, in 4s, in 6s or in 12s. And if you get a chance, next time you're walking in those streets, have a look at the houses. Selwyn Avenue, Cavendish Road, although they are all one long terrace, they certainly weren't all built by one developer or one builder. The Xylonite Works were opened in 1897. All Saints on the Hill was built in 1898. All Saints, the parish we are in, was formerly, first of all, it was part of St Mary's, Wolfmans Stowe. The whole of Wolfmans Stowe, before it became an urban district, was in the parish of St Mary's. St Peter's in the Forest was carved out of St Mary's. So Highams Park, as we know it, right up to the old Wolfmans Stowe boundary, was in the parish of St Peter in the Forest, and then All Saints on the Hill was built in 1898, when the parish of All Saints Highams Park was actually formed. The parish of All Saints Highams Park follows roughly the manorial boundaries west, minus the E17 part. There is a little bit, I think, of the parish in E17, but if you imagine that, I'm not going to take you back, the old leg of mutton map of the Manor of Heckham, that is roughly the parish of All Saints Highams Park. The Warners left for Suffolk in 1902. Like a number of landowners in the Greater London area, or the Greater London area as it became, they benefited from selling land, developing. The Warners developed land in quite in a very unique way. The half-house flats. The flats on Chingford Lane were actually the prototype for the Warner half-house flats in the rest of the borough. And the Warners, I haven't mentioned as part of this talk, but they built the villas on Montauk Road in the 1890s. I mentioned one thing, those villas were a bit of a financial, not really a disaster because they rented them, but they weren't able to sell them. They were too big and they were too far from a station, because the Warners built the villas at a time when the Hale Farm Estate was being developed. Can you imagine trying to get, before roads were tarmacked, from Montauk Road either to Hale End Station or to Woodford Station? You'd have had to have used the horse and cart, and in many ways anyone living on the Hale Park estate had a much better deal in terms of transport. So the Warners left. They did make a lot of money, I'm not suggesting they didn't. 1903 the station was rebuilt. Selwyn School was built as early as 1904, first of all for boys, then girls, and then mixed infants. Winchester Road Church. John Hitchman, who had laid out the Waltham Farm Estate, gave money for the building of Winchester Road Church, and the Beech Hall Estate was built, Beech Hall Road. The Royal Oak, now we're on to pubs. Highams Park was an area where the temperance movement dominated. Dominated is never the right word, it was just a very genteel area, and an area formed around church life mostly. If you imagine the other side of the railway lines in Highams Park, and think about Cavendish Road with a Baptist church on, and a Methodist church almost at the other end of Howden Road, not quite, and a Church of England church, originally All Saints, which came in 1912. A very church-going community, but the Royal Oak was not, but I shouldn't say but, it's a very nice pub. The Royal Oak was already there. The Royal Oak was a pub in a building a bit like a house. 1906 was when that pub was rebuilt. The shops on Hale End Road and Winchester Road were built in 1906, as I said, and in 1908 the County Arms was built. There was a petition from a deaconess connected with one of the churches against the licence for the County Arms. Temperance didn't quite hold sway, but was very strong. The subway was built in 1909. 1911 the Electric Theatre was built. All Saints Selwyn Avenue built in 1912. That was demolished, I think, in 1976. And then in 1917, Highams Park Baptist Church was built on its present site, but it was built at the rear of the present site. As I said, we were going to end at 1910, just like a train that's run off the buffers. I think we're now at 1917. Thank you very much.